Good morning, good afternoon, and
Good evening.
welcome to R.W.A. Radicals with Age. My name is Jesse.
And my name is Pancho.
We are recording this on January 8th, 2025. Currently, unfortunately, in Southern California, much of our land is on fire. There's some massive wildfires going on in the north of Los Angeles. Fortunately, I'm a little bit south of that, but it is just a stark reminder how urgent this climate crisis is in this country. Regardless of your opinion, there are massive changes happening that are affecting the lives of tons of human beings who, other than choosing the wrong place to live, which I don't know if you've been to Southern California, there's lots of nice places to live, but just because of dryness and increasing temperatures and lack of rain and precipitation, you now have these huge fires raging, destroying people's homes, forcing people to evacuate. And though Donald Trump has been elected, neither major party in the United States is committed enough to addressing this crisis because there is no incentive in capitalism to fix problems having to do with the environment. There's no money to be made for making things safer, for conserving resources. We are in an infinite growth economy. And so we continue to be shackled with some of these issues, which then get played out where innocent people have their homes and livelihood destroyed. It's
I just
really,
saw
really
a
sad.
thing on the computer where last week, in anticipation of the fires, a lot of insurance companies canceled fire insurance for people.
There you go, right? And that somehow is legal because, again, it's the corporations that dictate policy and how these things work. They don't want to cover your policy. They want you to pay your premiums day after day, month after month, year after year. And when you actually need it, they do everything in their power to not cover you because insurance companies' incentives are once again to make money. It's not about helping people.
Perfect example of capitalism. We make money and we screw you.
Yeah. It's how it's designed to work. We need to stop focusing on people being so committed to being mad at certain individuals. Sure, Donald Trump annoys me, and if you're someone more rightly persuaded, then Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi annoy you. Us as radicals, all of them annoy us, but it's time to stop blaming individuals and start looking at these overarching systems that continue to go unchecked. But anyway, that is always our focus of, or our core focus of this program. But our topic today does not have to do with the environment, but I'm sure we'll get there sometime soon. Since we are now in 2025, we are now celebrating 50 years since the end of the Vietnam War, a war that saw 2 million civilians of Vietnamese population killed, 1.1 million Northern Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers killed, 200,000 from the South Vietnamese army killed, 58,000 American soldiers killed, 300,000 Cambodians, and at least 20,000 Laotians. So, an extremely devastating and brutal, bloody war, the first war that was televised, where you had nightly news coverage talking about the atrocities being committed. You also had, I'm sure most people have heard of the Gulf of Tonkin and the use that got us into the war, and then the use of Agent Orange, the herbicide that was used to wipe out an estimated 7.7 million acres of forest. And not only did it wipe out forest, which of course is going to lead to all sorts of environmental problems that we just vaguely touched on, but of course, if you're spraying forests with tons and tons of chemicals that are strong enough to just wipe out forests, it's going to, of course, have massive effects on the people, birth defects, people dying later in life, getting poisoned. It is a mess. It also, to bring it to capitalism, that war cost us about $77 billion a year. Money that could have been much, much more better appropriated. All of this under the guise to fighting the spread of communism and socialism. I start to wonder if all of those costs, all of those lives were worth it. I'm sure we'll get into that today. But what's really interesting about this war is that it was raging when my co-host and father had just gotten into college. And so a very formative time in your life, a time where you had just started to become, legal age, the ability to vote. And for you, among some of the first Black people being able to vote. And now the risk of getting drafted and having to go get plucked out of college and going to fight in that clearly unjust and immoral war. So, just a couple of thoughts from me. But Dad, I'm going to turn it over to you as a young man growing up in this country at that time, going to that shit ass school with a tree as a mascot. What were some of the things going on in your mind and your head that maybe still impact you today? As we think about now our this 50-year anniversary.
So one correction to what you said is that in 1968, I could not vote. At that time, the voting age was 21.
Oh, shit.
You couldn't drink, you couldn't vote, but you could go to Vietnam and get killed,
Mm.
which was one of the greatest ironies of all time. So, in talking about Vietnam, I would say that the Vietnam War was probably, in terms of politics, the most significant event in my life. I was 18 years old in 1968. In the spring of 1968, there had been campus protests all over the country, most notably at Berkeley and Columbia. I was a high school senior then, and hundreds of people were arrested at Columbia for sitting in buildings. And it was a very traumatic time. When I went to college in the fall of 68, I had already been very radicalized in being anti the Vietnam War. When I was in college, there were police on campus arresting people all 4 years that I was in college. So for everybody of my college cohort, the Vietnam War was an incredibly important and traumatic event. I had been radicalized much earlier than that. I think, as we had talked in an earlier segment of the show, growing up in Harlem and seeing Fidel come to the UN in 1960 and meeting with Malcolm X. I was always a celebrant of both Malcolm and of the Cuban Revolution. When I was in high school, in my religion class, we had a segment in which, so this was 1966, 1967. In my religion class in high school, we talked about the evils of the Vietnam War. It was always something in the forefront of my mind. And then the country announced, because it needed more troops, it announced that there was going to be a draft in December of 1969. Prior to that, people had been drafted into the military, but it was essentially only for poor people. If you were in school, in any kind of school, undergraduate, law school, medical school, whatever, you could finish your schooling before you could get drafted. With the need for an exceedingly greater number of troops, they changed that position so that with the draft, the first real draft in the fall of 1969, if you were drafted and you were in school, you could only finish that year and then you had to go in.
And what a perfect example of interest convergence that we've talked about, that it wasn't that it was fucked up that only poor people were going to die overseas. I mean, obviously it was, but that wasn't enough to change people's minds. It was that, oh, there's this need for more troops. So yeah, I guess now we'll extend it from not just poor people to but to everybody.
Precisely. In December of 1969 was when the draft happened. So that was the beginning of my sophomore year in college. Everybody was uptight because they had this lottery. They had ping pong balls and they twisted the thing, and every ping pong ball had a date in it. And the first ping pong ball that came out was number one, whatever that date was. And if your birth date came out in the first approximately 200, you were going to get sent to Vietnam. And so before that, everybody had to go through this process of deep thinking about what are you going to do if you get a bad number. There were 7 or 8 options that people had. Some more obvious than others. Obviously, you could go to Vietnam. You could choose to not go if you had a bad number and go to jail. You could,
2 years, right?
2 years. You could starve yourself so that you were under the minimum weight requirements. I had friends in my dorm who did that. And every night when we went to dinner in the dorm, they just ate lettuce in order to get their weight down. So you could go to jail, you could starve, you could just ignore your draft notice and go underground. You could go to Canada. You could choose to be a conscientious objector, and that involved a whole process. You had to have religious people write letters saying that you were a conscientious objector and couldn't morally go. The problem with that was that in order to be a conscientious objector, you could not just be opposed to the Vietnam War, you had to be opposed to all wars. I had priests who were willing to write letters for me as a conscientious objector. I totally appreciated that, but I turned the offer down because I could not, in good conscience, say that I believed that all wars were wrong. As I had said before, I was a supporter of the Cuban Revolution and getting rid of Fulgencio Batista. And so I thought that that war by Fidel in the Sierra Maestra was a war that was justified.
But didn't you think that lying to the government was okay compared to getting shipped to go kill people in Vietnam?
I did think about that, but rightly or wrongly, because I had gone to Catholic school, what I was taught was, to tell the truth and to stand up for your moral beliefs.
Mm.
And so I did not feel that in good conscience, I could say that I was a conscientious objector. And obviously, had I chosen that route, my life would have been totally easier and I would not have had to worry about any of that. I will also say in the summer of 1969, at the end of my freshman year in college, I was living in Hong Kong with my parents who were in the Foreign Service. And one of the things I had to endure was going to various social events, cocktail parties, and things like that. And at those events, I was generally the only person there who was in my generation. So I was constantly approached by generals and admirals and saying, "What the hell is going on? with college students
On college
and
campuses.
on college campuses, and it was an incredibly awkward situation for me to be in. I
Yeah, to either
also
put your to either, potentially get your folks in trouble by saying, well, what's going on campuses is that campus police are doing horrible things and treating these students terribly who are just protesting a unjust war. But of course, that probably wouldn't have looked good if you said that.
that would not have looked good, and that would have put my parents in a bad situation. So I had to very much control what I said in those situations, which is why I hated being there. I spent a lot of time hanging out with the Marines who were guarding the US consulate. Hong Kong was a big place where military people from Vietnam went on R&R.
Mm.
And so there were tons of military people in Hong Kong, and they were there for, like a week or two on their R&R and then went back to Vietnam. But the military guards at the consulate were there all the time. So most nights I was hanging out with the military guards, especially the Marines.
And this was the summer before
This was the
that
summer.
draft.
This was the summer before the draft. So one afternoon, I was hanging out with my mother, and she just casually started this conversation. Oh, the draft is coming up in X number of months. What are you going to do if you get drafted? And I said to her, there's no universe in which I am going to go to Vietnam. I am morally opposed to this war. I don't think we should be fighting it. It's this fake war to prevent the quote unquote domino theory from happening. And her response was twofold. On the one hand, she was sympathetic to what I said. She didn't want her son to go in Vietnam and get killed or whatever. But her real response was, don't ever say that to your father because he'll kick you out.
Yeah.
And, understandable. He was working for the State Department, and that was the position that he had to take. So I decided that I was going to go to jail. I thought very seriously about going to Canada, but at that point, if you went to Canada, you could never, ever come back to the United States because you would be a convicted felon.
Mm.
And rightly or wrongly at the time, I was uptight about the thought of never being able to come back to the United States and going to Canada with nothing, not having a job, not having whatever. So I figured that I could handle 2 years in jail. Of course, it would have depended on whether it was a minimum security or maximum security jail, and that depended on where you were, because in some locations, people were so pissed off at Vietnam protesters that they put them in maximum security prisons. So my draft, I was living in California. My draft address was in New York. So I actually didn't know whether I would get put in a maximum or a minimum security prison. But I felt that, rightly or wrongly, naively or not, I figured I could handle 2 years in
What
jail.
was what were college's positions on that? Like, would you had that happen, or did you know people in school? Like, would you have been able to then resume your education, or was there potential somewhat massive, economic hit that then once you got out, it's like, well, you're a convicted whatever felon or whatever it was for that. So now, now we're not going to let you back into Stanford or wherever other folks went to school.
Actually, I don't know the answer to that. I would have been a convicted felon, and it would have been up to the university to decide whether to take me back. And then there's even the whole question of, after being in jail for 2 years, would I want to go back to school?
Mm.
I have no idea. Um,
Needless to say, it would have changed your life pretty massively.
it definitely would have changed my life massively. But I believed at the time, and I still believe, that it was the right thing to do. I was totally opposed to the Vietnam War. There was no universe in which I was going to go into the military, and I was making a conscious moral decision, and I was willing to suffer the consequences of that decision. So, as I was saying, the options were go to Vietnam, go to jail, starve yourself, ignore when you got called and essentially go underground, go to Canada, become a conscientious objector, or there's the Alice's Restaurant by Arlo Guthrie solution, you know, get arrested for some minor thing, and that would prevent you from going in, or pretend to be gay and go in all flamboyant, and they would not take you in that situation.
Doesn't he also, that song, if any viewers aren't familiar, it's a great, hilarious song that my mom made us listen to at Thanksgiving time. And I think it's close to 20 minutes long and it's funny and fun. But as a kid, being forced to listen to a 20-minute song you don't really understand is confusing. Isn't there also a part about, similar vein to starving yourself, but like disfiguring yourself in some sort of way, smashing I can't remember what it is in the song, but I think that's an example too, that somebody smashes a finger or a toe or
Oh,
something like
yeah,
that to
you
dodge
could.
it too.
Disfiguration was also a way of getting yourself out of the draft. So if you cut off a finger,
Can't pull the trigger.
you can't pull the trigger. And so, you know, people my age whom I knew were all so massively anti the Vietnam War that they were willing to do whatever to prevent themselves from going. And again, you had to make this decision before the actual date of the draft. You couldn't say, "Oh, maybe I'll be lucky and I'll get a good number," because that would be too much too soon to have decided. So for months in advance, everyone was, "What am I gonna do?"
Yeah. And really, I mean, not everybody literally, of course, but I looked up this. There was 200,000 draft dodgers. And so those are people who got selected and, you know, didn't just say, oh, you know what, didn't get pulled into the, because I'm sure there was so much, it wasn't this, you talk about it like this intense scary thing, but I'm sure there was so much propaganda of like, this is, you're doing this for your country and your brothers. And it happens this to this day that there's so much money that gets poured into trying to convince people that this is an honorable, noble thing to do. And despite that, 200,000 people who got chosen and could have just said, you know what, maybe I'll be one of the lucky ones, or maybe this is good for the country. No. And then on top of that, there was also a huge issue in this war with desertions. 30,000 people who I found, it said that it wasn't so much in like active combat, but still that people just refused to fight once they were there and got these, dishonorable discharges, which have some pretty, lengthy penalties and stuff too. And then finally, I didn't have time to look into this too much, and it also just made me so sad as the phenomenon of fragging, which I actually didn't know what that meant. I someone who, of course, grew up in the 90s. And so that was something that we'd say online playing video games. Oh, what a frag when you killed somebody. But fragging is actually the intentional murder of superior officers. So like literally rebelling against the people forcing you to fight. So so clear, that yeah, the propaganda wasn't working on a huge swath of people. But of course, as we discussed a little bit before this too, this is the time that your boy Richard Nixon got elected, and Henry Kissinger, who we know has such a horrible, horrible history. And of course, Nixon didn't last all that long because he got impeached with Watergate, which stemmed from this too. So lots of directions to go in. Didn't mean to interrupt you too much, but just wanted to add to that this was a huge campaign to try and draw people in, but there was so many people who stood up against this that people were willing to cut off their fingers, to go to jail, to get there and then to leave, to have their livelihoods messed up. And so I just think it's important to take a moment to recognize it's not just the sad stories of the 58,000 soldiers who lost their lives there, and of course the millions of other people on various sides of it. But that's so many lives, a whole portion of a generation had their lives ruined by this war just because of a fucking ping pong ball. It's crazy.
So, a couple of things. I had an elementary school classmate whose name was Morris Lee, who got drafted and went and got killed. I knew people who had been in Vietnam and came back, and they were screwed up in various ways. I happened to be in Washington, D.C. the weekend when Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial was unveiled. In some ways, the most important thing to talk about is why was the Vietnam War fought in the first place?
Right.
And it was a war about capitalism and the desire of the Vietnamese to be free from the imperialism and colonialism of France and the United States. As you may know, Vietnam was essentially a colony of France. There started to be an uprising against the French colonial powers that started in the 40s and lasted until the mid 1950s, when the Vietnamese finally won at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu and kicked the French out. That was in I believe 1954.
That's what I have.
And
And the US
yeah,
funded the French in that too.
and
Like there
the
was this concerted effort.
yes, the US funded the French, and then when the French were defeated, that was when the US essentially started taking over. And the whole thing, the theory was what was called the domino theory, that if Vietnam, quote unquote, fell to the communists, then all of Southeast Asia would fall to the communists. And those countries would become under the influence of some combination of China and Russia. And then that whole part of the world would be unavailable to United States capitalist influence. And so that was the argument that the United States used to justify continuing to add more and more troops. To go back to the draft issue for a moment, as I had said earlier, police were on campus at my school all 4 years. And all of that time it was because of protests against the Vietnam War. I was tear gassed more than once. Very unpleasant experience to be tear gassed. Once I got a letter from my mother that said, if you get arrested, make sure we are the last people you call. And I took that letter and I hung it up on the main bulletin board in my dorm so that everybody could read it. As you can imagine, my parents and I were not getting along very well during that time period. So anyway, we eventually got to draft time. So this was the first week in December of 1969. So as I said, there were 366 ping pong balls with a date on it. I remember sitting in the lounge in my sophomore dorm, and everybody was incredibly uptight about what their number was going to be. And as I said, I had friends who got low numbers and who I had one friend who starved himself. I had another friend who went underground, and they kept going, drawing the numbers. They kept going, they kept going, they kept going. And they had told us that if your number, they had said at the time that if your number was in the first 100 or so, you would definitely have to go to Vietnam. It actually turned out if your number was in the first 200 or so, you were going to have to go to Vietnam. I was incredibly fortunate. My number was 345. So there was no universe in which I was going to have to make that decision. The gods were
Lucky,
on the gods were on my side.
lucky 420.
Lucky 420 in more ways than one.
Exactly.
Um, so that was a relief. I continued to be involved in anti-war activities. I actually got kicked out of a French class because I missed too many classes going to demonstrations, which happened to be at the same time that my French class was. And my French teacher, I was getting good grades in my French class. And she said, your work is very good, but you have to come to class. And I said, I'm doing all the work and I'm getting good grades. And she said, sorry,
Mm.
and kicked me out of my French class.
And I'm sure that that was, I wonder if there was pressure on her to, like on the faculty in general, to try and do tactics like that to squash people going to demonstrations.
Oh, very much so. And it was very clear at the time that the administration of the university was very much not in favor of various student protests. It was the college administration that called the police to come onto campus. And as I said, all 4 years that I was in college, there were police on campus arresting people for demonstrations.
And it's particularly interesting with Stanford too, it being a private place that they didn't have to do that at all. And
They did not have to do it. It was a clear decision by the administration because their position was that people demonstrating was disrupting, uprooting the purpose of the college, which was to educate people. So if people were boycotting classes or, demonstrating in front of buildings and preventing things from happening, that needed to be stopped. So the administration, all 4 years, made that decision.
yeah. And obviously a horrible one, but unfortunately, or fortunately, not as bad as other ones. I think it was in a little bit later on, I think early 70s, 'cause I think Nixon was already president, but when I think it was four demonstrators got killed at Kent State and Ohio too. So you had these really intense, violent clashes with police that led to people dying on college campuses. So you would think administrations, even before that, would say, when enough students have gathered to do this, yeah, this is a disruption, but maybe there's something behind this, and there's something greater than, you know, preserving the decorum of your school. Maybe, these students are onto something. This is something that we should have a whole discussion about and think about and talk about. This is bigger than French class.
Yeah, so at Kent State in Ohio, they called the National Guard
Right.
onto campus. It wasn't even just the local police, it was the National Guard. And they came onto campus. Students were peacefully protesting, and the National Guard just opened fire and killed 4 people. Of course, as you know, there was the great Neil Young song in response to that, Four Dead in Ohio.
Yeah, it's so crazy. And I mean, we had instances of this over the last 2 years. It's funny that Colombia is was such a big sort of national story about Vietnam protests, because it was once again in protests against Israel and the genocide going on in Gaza. That once again you have these clashes of students and administration and police getting involved.
Wait,
And
wait, 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 wait. Are you saying that there's genocide going on in Gaza?
not to go down a huge rabbit hole, But of course, absolutely. And I know people certainly disagree about the definition of genocide.
There's
And
nothing to
it's,
disagree with on this topic. It's clearly what is happening in Gaza is genocide.
yeah, sort of, you know, it is interesting to think about because, of course, there are degrees of genocide, right? There's horrific instances we have in our history where people are just slaughtered, and it's clear that Israel is not quite doing that. They are, it's an argument I hear from people all the time. Well, if Israel wanted to commit a genocide, they could do it, and they're not. Well, they are.
Actually, they
They're
are
just not
doing
doing it
it,
as gruesomely and horribly, sure, as they could. But of course,
but it's pretty gruesome and horrible. I just saw on the news yesterday that now 8 children in Gaza have died from freezing to death. It is horribly atrocious what is going on there. But as you said, that's a topic for another episode. The first week of December in 1969 was when the draft happened. That was an incredibly momentous week. The previous week, the end of the previous week, the Rolling Stones had just released their, I believe it was their eighth album, Let It Bleed, which I, to this day, think is their best album. And so at the beginning of the week, there was the draft. At the end of the week, there was the concert at Altamont, where the Rolling Stones performed. And when it was supposed to be a West Coast version of Woodstock that had happened the previous year. I wasn't at Woodstock because I was in Hong Kong, but I was at Altamont and I did see, literally saw the Hells Angels killing Meredith Hunter by beating him to death with pool cues. Saw the Rolling Stones perform, and for many people, that symbolically was the end of the sort of peace and love vision of the 1960s. I don't totally agree with that idea, but Altamont was definitely a traumatic experience. And also during the same week, so at the beginning of the week, at the end of the previous week, the Rolling Stones release the album. At the beginning of the week is the draft. At the end of the week is Altamont. And in the middle of the week was the assassination of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in Chicago. Fred Hampton being the head of the Chicago chapter of the Black Panthers, murdered in his bed in the middle of the night.
hmm,
No defense. And I have seen the films of it, and it was horrible. And of course, the police claimed that they just showed up innocuously at 2 o'clock in the morning and just knocked on the door innocently, and shooting started from inside. And of course, it was later proved that that was completely untrue, and it was the police who were doing all the shooting. As you know, the Panthers were viewed as some revolutionary group that the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover decided had to be taken out, and they were willing to do whatever was necessary in order to destroy the Panthers. One thing I want to say is that when people think of the Panthers, they too often think of quote unquote militants walking around holding guns. And the most important thing that the Panthers did, in fact, didn't have anything to do with that. It had to do with their connection to the community. the free breakfast program, the free health clinics. They made a huge impact on the lives of poor Black people. And that aspect of the Panthers is has not been sufficiently talked about. I think I said in a previous episode that a couple of years ago, I taught a course on the Panthers, and there was a Panther chapter in Portland. And the person who was the head of the Panthers in Portland, I reached out to him and got him to come and talk to my class, which was totally cool. So anyway, we're talking about Vietnam. We're talking about it being a capitalist war against any kind of socialism. Part of the reason why the Vietnam War happened, as far as the United States was concerned, is that after the French left and Vietnam was divided into North and South, this was in 1954, there was an agreement that in 1956 there were going to be elections, and the theoretical result would be the unification of North and South Vietnam. And when the US realized that if that election happened, Ho Chi Minh would be elected as the president of all of Vietnam, then the United States prevented the election from happening. And that's what really got the Vietnam War going to the massive extent that it did. And Ho Chi Minh, to this day, is viewed as essentially the George Washington of Vietnam. I don't know if you know this. So Ho grew up in Vietnam. He was part of the resistance to French imperialism. And when he thought he was about to get arrested, he left. And he ended up coming to the United States.
Oh, wow.
And among other things, he was a pastry chef in Boston.
Interesting. And there is that, it's so funny because, and it's why I think nuance is so important in everyday conversation and in politics and history, because the French Vietnamese food fusion culture is amazing.
Precisely.
The banh mi sandwich that is Vietnamese vegetables and meats on a delicious French baguette. So like there are positive things that come out of this stuff. I'm interested though, you started making well, actually, if you have more to say about Ho Chi Minh, we're starting to run short on time. So if you want to close that chapter on Ho Chi Minh, I want you to, because there's lots more to be said. But so yeah, let me not stall you.
Well, the only other thing I will say is that when Ho was in the United States, he attended some meetings of Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association. And in his autobiography, he also claims that he went to the South and witnessed a lynching. And that obviously fueled his revolutionary ideas about how people of color were being oppressed.
I am curious, and you might not know the answer to this. I was trying to interview someone I know who spent lots of time in Vietnam, before, during, and after the war, or during and after the war. Saigon, the southern capital of Vietnam, after the war got renamed as Ho Chi Minh City, and
Correct.
you just said that he was sort of the George Washington, but anytime I hear about it, it's still called Saigon now. I think even by Vietnamese people. So is there still sort of like I know there's tons of Americans that spend time over there. There's been this sort of whole campaign to, continue to try and, stick those capitalist fingers in there. So is that one of those symbolic battles? Do you know much about that the naming of that city?
I actually don't know the answer to that. I do know that it is officially Ho Chi Minh City. I do not know what people who lived there call it. I can imagine that older people who lived there when it was called Saigon would continue to call it that. But I would imagine that younger people who have grown up only knowing it as Ho Chi Minh City, that's what they would call it.
But you would think then as well, American sort of people, or certainly, pro-war American people would probably call it Saigon too, because they wouldn't want to invoke Ho Chi Minh.
Yes, that is probably true, but my sense is that American military people who have gone back there, they're not going back there as, victorious Americans,
Right.
because after all, the Americans lost. And interestingly enough, to get back to the language topic, people in Vietnam do not refer to the war as the Vietnam War. They refer to it as the American War. Only we call it the Vietnam War.
Yeah, and I didn't write it down. There's a full name of it too. It's like the American War is the short version. It's like
Right.
remove Americans from save Vietnam from the Americans War or something like
Exactly.
that.
Exactly. Exactly. The
Well,
other thing I want to say is I find it very interesting that Vietnam is a quote unquote communist country. And the United States has direct relations with Vietnam despite the war. The United States has relations with communist China. The United States has relations with communist Russia, but the United States has refused to end the embargo against the people of Cuba.
yeah, very strange. And we've talked about this, so we need to put a pin on Cuba and do a whole episode for it because it deserves that. And I think that's will be a really interesting one too, because I think there are these people. I don't think Ho Chi Minh is known well enough for him to be one of these people, but Fidel, who else was I just thinking about? There's other leaders, like Gaddafi, who just have this like automatic negative connotation in the minds of many Americans who don't know the story. They just know that's a bad person. And again, nuance. There's these things. I'm sure Fidel was far from perfect in everything he did, but obviously there's a lot more to that story there. But I want to get us back to sort of wrap us up because again, time is short. You mentioned these other big events that happened literally the same week as the draft, particularly with the Black Panthers. And it sounds like to me that there was two wars happening at this time, a foreign war against communism, socialism, etc., and then this domestic war against the Panthers. And again, a group that was, like you said, giving free breakfasts, free healthcare, very socialist ideas. And they, of course, pushed for that. So do you think is that just a coincidence or is that a very clear thing that there was sort of two wars happening at the same time?
I do not think that it was a coincidence. I think that J. Edgar Hoover, who was running the FBI, he saw quote unquote domestic problems, i.e., the Panthers, as feeding into the anti war in Vietnam strain. And so defeating the communists in Vietnam and defeating people domestically who were opposed to Vietnam, like the Panthers, that was all part of the same thing. So, yes, there was the war in Vietnam and there was the war at home. And unfortunately, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI did a relatively quote unquote good job in terms of undermining the Panthers and what they were trying to accomplish. And that
As
speaks to the larger topic of poverty in America. Why was it necessary for the Panthers to have free breakfast programs for kids? Why was it necessary for the Panthers to have free health clinics for people? because in our capitalist society, people don't have access equally to food, to healthcare, to job opportunities, etc.
Yeah. And I was just going to say the CIA and the US military, despite losing the wars we know, still kind of won this political war that there's still, you know, again, this was just one of the things the Nixon administration did. There were many other successful coups and meddling in other countries. We've of course talked extensively about Allende in Chile.
And not just Allende in Chile,
Yeah.
Arbenz in Guatemala, in Iran. You know, the whole
Mm.
Iran revolution, quote unquote, happened because Iran elected somebody that we didn't like. The CIA got him kicked out, and then we had the Shah, who totally screwed up Iran, and that led to Ayatollah Khomeini, who screwed up things even worse. And Iran is still suffering from the results of that. And, you know, as you said, Chile, Grenada, Panama, the US has intervened all over the world whenever it has wanted to.
And that's what I wanted to ask you as a sort of wrap up question is it seems as though this war is still being waged, that there is still a vested interest on the capitalist American side to continue to squash revolutions, social and political movements that are advocating for socialism. There is still this McCarthy era fear in so many American minds that capitalism is the only way. And if you embrace communism or socialism or anything anti-capitalist, you're anti-freedom and anti-American and should be completely ridiculed and shunned and arrested or killed or any combination of that. So the question I sort of leave you with is this you think this war is kind of still happening and what can we do about it?
I think the war is still happening, as we said in an earlier episode when we were talking about Chile. It blows my mind that the US thinks it has the best form of government, and any form of socialism they think is ridiculous and bound to fail. But if you really believed that, you would let socialist governments come into existence and let them fail. And then you can say, see, we were right. But interestingly enough, whenever a socialist government comes into power, we send in the troops, which means we are actually afraid that some form of socialism is actually the best way for people to live. I think we should take over the Panama Canal. I think we should take over Greenland. And I think we should make Canada the 51st state.
Not Puerto Rico, which has like sort of been a state for
Well,
decades.
seriously, I would say what I wish would happen is I think there should be a referendum. You know, the US is acting as a colonial empire. The people in Puerto Rico, Guam, the Virgin Islands, and
Samoa.
and DC,
Mm.
there should be an election in all those places and give the people a chance to exercise what they want to have happen. They should become states or they should become independent countries. And there was that great speech a couple of days ago by the US representative from the Virgin Islands when she stood up at the meeting in Congress and said, you know, you just called the roll of all the states. Why didn't you mention DC? Why didn't you mention Puerto Rico? Why didn't you mention the Virgin Islands, et cetera, et cetera?
Why are we even here?
Exactly. She was great.
Well, it has come to be that time for now, but we have a lot more for you. We only just scratched the surface with some of this stuff. I hope that you learned a thing or two during this past hour. Maybe just in that last little bit there, or somewhere else throughout the episode, something caused you to smile. In the words of the not late, he's still just very elderly, great Noam Chomsky in 1975. No outside power will compel us to face the record honestly. On the contrary, efforts will be devoted to obscuring the history of the war and the domestic resistance to it, which I just think is so spot on. And our song of the week, in addition to all of those Vietnam protest songs, we mentioned a few of them, and there are many, many others. We haven't been able to shout them out on the show, I don't think yet, but I love the band Rage Against the Machine. They were hugely influential in my young life. Their first self-titled album, the album cover depicts the image, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, but of Thick Quang Duc, a monk in South Vietnam who literally set himself on fire as an act of protest. And so that image was on Rage Against the Machine's first album cover, kind of scarred in my brain of as a kid, I was like, wow, this is such a cool image, and wasn't really able to connect it. That was a literal human being who thought that things were so messed up that he killed himself in an act of protest. Really, really intense, emotional, and powerful. The song that I think resonates the most with this show and is probably my favorite of theirs, not on their first album, it's on a later album, but the song is called The Renegades of Funk. So check that out. Check out the R.W.A. playlist, which has lots of these songs already there. But for now, for Jesse and Pancho, thank you so much for joining us on Radicals with Age, and we will see you after a while.